I don't know how often you have set out to tackle a project. Maybe it's a project at work, maybe a project for school, maybe a project around the house, maybe if you're one of those who works on your car, maybe it's an automotive project. But you quickly determine as you begin that you've got the wrong tool for the job. That you don't have what you need to complete the task. Now, sometimes you can take what you've got and sort of figure out a way to make it work, right? So if you've got a socket wrench and you've got a set of standard sockets, but the part that you're trying to loosen is metric, sometimes you can kind of take one that's close enough and just sort of angle it or torque it enough or kind of force it on there to get the job done. So not exactly the right tool, but you can make it work in a pinch. Or if you're trying to plunge a toilet, I know that's an unsavory idea for a Sunday morning at church, but we're real here, right? I didn't know this until I was a grown adult, but that plunger that everybody's got in your house, that kind of pink, round, just flat one on the bottom that's kind of flared at the end, that is actually a drain plunger. That is not a toilet plunger. They make a different kind of plunger for toilets. But again, in a pinch, sometimes you can make that work. But that's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a tool that definitively cannot get the job done. A few years ago, I was replacing the threshold on our front door, the aluminum threshold right there at the bottom of our front door, which required me to drill holes into the foundation to mount it to the slab. So I got my drill, I put the right size bit in there. I even think I had the right bit, a masonry bit for concrete, made sure that it was spinning in the right direction. And so I mark the holes and I start to drill. And that thing spins and it whines, and nothing. I'm making zero progress. So I think, well, maybe I'm not pushing hard enough. And so I really lay into it. And as you can tell, I like my Bluebell ice cream, so there's a lot of weight there pressing on that drill, but it's not moving. And so for a good 10 minutes, I'm trying to get this drill to put a hole in the concrete, and it isn't working. So I do what you do in those situations. I call my dad. And he says, "You're using a hammer drill, right?" To which I responded, "A hammer what now?" I had no idea that there was a specific tool that was made for drilling into concrete, a hammer drill. Here I was trying to get the job done with a regular drill. I had the wrong tool for the job. Now, typically, when you're trying to accomplish something with the absolute wrong tool that was never designed for what you're asking it to do, it leads only to frustration and defeat. You try and you fail. You try and you fail. You try and you fail. At some point, maybe you say some bad words and then you give up. Well, the Apostle Paul describes a similar experience when it comes to spiritual life, specifically when it comes to God's law. The law that he gave to Moses and the people of Israel at Mount Sinai, summarized in the Ten Commandments. Throughout the book of Romans, Paul has repeatedly told us what that list of rules, what that law can do, what it's designed for. In chapter 2, he says the law instructs righteous behavior, tells you how to live. That's what it was given for. That's what it was made for. In chapter 3, he says the law demands perfect obedience and gives those who don't live up to that standard a knowledge of what their failure is. It's sin. Right? That's what the law does. It's what it was made to do. In chapter 4, he says the law brings wrath on those who don't keep it. It increases their trespass, their offense, by naming it and defining it. That's what the law is for. And in chapter 7, the law, he says, arouses sinful passions and it holds people captive. That's what the law does. Now, in all of this, Paul has affirmed that the law, the Ten Commandments, this list of rules from God given to man, that it is holy and it is righteous and it is good in doing the things that it was intended to do. But beginning in the middle of chapter 7, he starts to really dig into what the law cannot do. So it's a good tool for its intended use, right? Just like that drill that I was using, if I was trying to drill through wood, perfect. It's made for it. The law is good for its intended use. In fact, 1 Timothy 1 verses 8 and 9 says, "Now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law was not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners." But when it comes to people's battle against sin, that fight against sinful tendencies and sinful desires and sinful behaviors, when it comes to people's pursuit of righteousness, Paul says it is the wrong tool for the job. The law, this list of rules given by God to man, cannot break the power of sin. It cannot make God's promises a reality. It was never intended to fulfill that role, and it brings only frustration and defeat to those who try to use it for that. Now, last week we saw in Romans chapter 7, verses 9 through 13, how Paul described his own experience as a non-Christian. So his pre-conversion testimony, right? If any of you have, if I'm assuming most of you probably have come to a point in your life when you know Jesus, you could probably go back in time and tell the story of what your life was like before you came to Christ. That's what Paul tells in Romans chapter 7, verses 9 through 13. So I would actually encourage you to go ahead and take a Bible and turn to Romans chapter 7 so that you can follow along. So the story that Paul tells was a story that paralleled the story of Adam. All right, Adam says was alive, and the command came, sin sprang to life, and he died. It was a story that paralleled the story of the nation of Israel, and it was a story that applied in a general way to everybody. To me, to you, to everyone who believed. Everyone who has ever lived. Here's what he said in Romans chapter 7, verses 9 through 11. He says, "I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive and I died. The very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me, for sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me." Then in verse 12, he reiterated that the law, even though it played a role in his spiritual death, was itself holy and righteous and good. And then in verse 13, it serves as a kind of a summary statement, but also a bridge that leads to the next section that we're looking at this morning. That verse says this. He asks, "Did that which is good, the law, then bring death to me? By no means. It was sin, producing death in me through what is good, in order that sin might be shown to be sin, and through the commandment might become sinful beyond measure." So to sum all that up, Paul says that he once considered himself alive apart from the law. So he was born with no awareness of the law, no awareness of God's demands, no awareness of his own sin or his own guilt. But there came a point where the law came. He came to understand God's requirements, how the law defined righteousness, how it demanded obedience, how it exposed sin, how it promised judgment to those who transgressed it. And all those were good things. Necessary things for him to understand. But he says that when that happened, the sin that had been lurking just under the surface in him sprang to life. It, in essence, hijacked the law. It used that law to arouse sin in him and increase his transgression so that sin was shown to be immeasurably sinful. And then it brought condemnation and a full awareness of his spiritual condition, which was death. So the law was good, Paul said so. What was the problem? Sin was the problem. And then we read this. Romans chapter 7, beginning in verse 14. I'll read all the way down through the end of the chapter. Paul goes on, he says, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold under sin. For I do not understand my own actions. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree with the law that it is good. So now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inner being, but I see in my members another law waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. So once again, Paul here reaffirms that the law, the Ten Commandments, the rules that God gave us, he says it's good. He says it's spiritual. It originates from the Spirit of God. But there's a second problem besides the insufficiency of the law to provide what it demanded. Besides the fact that the law could be commandeered by the power of sin, there was another problem. What does he say that problem was? Paul says that problem is me. I'm the problem, Paul says. My fleshliness that put me in bondage to sin. What does Paul mean when he talks about fleshliness, when he says he's of the flesh? He's describing something that's the opposite of spiritual, right? He says the law is spiritual, of the Spirit, from the Spirit. He says I'm fleshly, I'm of the flesh. To be of the flesh is to be carnal. And he's not just referring to physicality. He's not just referring to anything that's material or anything tangible. He's not just talking about our physical bodies. To be fleshly is to be of this world, bound to the things and the systems and the priorities of this world. It's to be sensual. It's to be governed by our impulses and our desires and our inclinations. To be fleshly is to be ruled by self, to be self-focused and self-centered and self-empowered. Fleshliness is naturalness, fallenness, weakness. It's what comes instinctively to us, right? It's what comes inherently to all people. The kinds of passions and drives that you don't have to be taught. Well, just like sin hijacked the law, Paul says sin also hijacked us by means of our fleshliness to make us its captive. And so because of this natural fleshliness that has been commandeered by sin, Paul spends the rest of the chapter describing a struggle. A struggle between man and sin, a struggle between good desires and evil actions, a struggle between right longings and wrong behaviors. So let's walk through that description of some of the characteristics of that battle. What does he say about this struggle? In verse 15, he says that he doesn't understand his own actions. Well, that doesn't mean he's not aware of what he's doing. It means that he's perplexed by his own behavior. He's even frustrated by it. He's unable to fully comprehend why he does what he does. You ever been there before? Because according to verse 15, verse 18, verse 19, he doesn't and maybe even can't do what he wants to. Verse 15, he says, "For I do not do what I want." In verse 18, he says, "I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out." Verse 19, "For I do not do the good that I want." We all know what that feels like, doesn't it? Don't we? So, you ever been in this situation? You want to eat healthy, but you can't manage to. You can say amen. You want to exercise and get in shape, but you don't. You want to get out of debt, but you can't manage to get your spending under control. But Paul is speaking here about something deeper. He's speaking about moral desires, not just self-improvement. Paul says he wants to keep the law. He wants to do good. He wants to do right. He wants to meet the demands of God. He affirms again in verse 16, he says the law is good. What it demands is good, but he can't seem to do what he wants. And then it gets worse. He says instead of doing the thing that he wants to do in verse 15 and verse 19, he says he does the very thing that he hates. At the end of verse 15, he says, "But I do the very thing that I hate." The end of verse 19, he says something similar. "The evil that I do not want is what I keep on doing." It's one thing to not be able to do what you want. It's something entirely different to constantly do what you hate. So, to use my illustration from a second ago, not only are you not eating healthy foods, not only are you not eating fruits and vegetables, but you're eating a tub of Bluebell every night. This is not a personal testimony. Much. That simply compounds the failure and the frustration, right? It's not just that I don't do what I want, it's that I keep doing these things that I don't want to do, that I hate. But then he says in verses 17 and 20 that it's not him doing it. What is it that's doing it? It says it's the sin living in him. And in saying that, please understand, he's not trying to avoid accountability. He's not trying to avoid responsibility for his own actions. This isn't one of those "the devil made me do it" situations. He's simply saying that if it were only up to him, only up to what he wants, he would be good. He would do good, but something else is involved. The power of indwelling sin that seems to bind him and rule him. That's true of everyone that is in Adam from birth, apart from Christ. We are all born in that predicament. It isn't just us, but it is the sin in us. At the same time, he says at the beginning of verse 18 that nothing good lives in his flesh, in his fallen nature. Every part of his natural state is fallen and broken and infected with sin. Extends to every part of us. And so he concludes in verses 21 through 23 that there is this ongoing war between his inner being, his mind on the one hand, and his flesh, his members is what he calls them, on the other, in which his mind delights in God's law, the law of Moses, but the law of sin in his members imprisons him. And when he speaks of these two laws here, he's talking about two authorities. The inner person, his mind, delights in the authority and the demands of God, but the authority and demands of sin rule over his flesh. So what you see here is a vivid depiction of war. It's a battle. And it causes frustration due to this incongruity of his desires on the one hand and his actions on the other. They don't match. He wants to keep the law, he tries to keep the law, but he doesn't, and he can't keep the law because of indwelling sin. You with me so far? And this ongoing struggle, this inescapable frustration, this nagging inability leads to this desperate cry for rescue. In verse 24, look at it. He says, "Wretched man that I am, who will rescue me or who will deliver me from this body of death?" Wretched man that I am. You ever thought of yourself that way? Wretched. It's not pleasant. It's not the way that we want to see ourselves. A number of years ago, I had someone tell me that they didn't like that line in Amazing Grace because they didn't consider themselves a wretch. Right? Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. They didn't think they were wretched. They didn't like that song. Paul does. Paul thinks so, and rightly so, I think. Looking at himself, seeing his failure, seeing his misery, feeling that despair, he declares himself to be wretched, to be miserable, to be pathetic, to be deplorable. That's his assessment of himself, wretched. And he asks, who will deliver him from this body of death? He's longing for rescue, longing for salvation, longing for deliverance. What is he asking for there? Is he talking about the resurrection when Jesus returns and believers are raised and their bodies glorified and perfected? Or maybe he's talking about something that he wants to experience here and now, deliverance from this spiritual frustration and condemnation? I personally think it's probably both. It's the longing for an ultimate future salvation, but one that breaks into the present to be felt to some degree now. And speaking of that future glory breaking into the present, that's kind of what I think happens in verse 25. In the midst of all this struggle and frustration and defeat, there's this momentary cry of joy and relief that sort of sneaks in there as the ultimate answer to this despair. What does he say? Thanks be to God. How is that deliverance going to come? Through Jesus Christ our Lord. I think it's an anticipation of what's coming, what Paul's about to unpack in chapter 8. But for now, he goes back to summarize that struggle. He himself serves God's law, God's authority, God's demands with his mind, with what he wants to do. But he serves the law of sin, the demands of sin, the authority of sin, with his flesh, with what he actually does. So how do we apply this? What does this mean for us? Well, that's where the difficulty comes. I don't know if you were here last week, you might remember me mentioning that this was kind of a hard passage. This is where the struggle is. Because assuming that Paul is describing his own experience, but then seeking to apply it to his larger audience, what part of Paul's life is he describing? Is he describing the utter defeat that he came to know as a good law-keeping Jew, as a Pharisee before his conversion, as he tried to fix his spiritual deadness through his observance of the law, and therefore the battle that every person, every Christian faces before they come to faith? Or is he describing his ongoing struggle against sin as a Christian, and therefore the battle that every believer continues to fight against their sin? So is Paul describing the experience of a Christian or the experience of a non-Christian here? Let me show you why it's not that easy to figure out. On the one hand, he could be describing here the inevitable defeat of any non-Christian, especially an observant Jew like he was, his own experience as a Pharisee, any non-Christian who tries to achieve salvation through law keeping. All right, so he could be talking about an unbeliever. This is kind of the minority view, but it's held by a number of historical scholars, some modern scholars. So why might we think that's what it's talking about? Well, in verse 14, how does he describe himself? He says he is of the flesh, sold under sin. Well, back in chapter 6, he says that believers are dead to sin and are no longer slaves to it. Right? Back in chapter 3, verse 9, he said that it is those outside of Christ who are under sin. Not only that, but the whole section is filled with this language of lostness, flesh, captive, sold, wretched, deliver. So based on how he has used those designations up to this point, you might naturally think, well, he's talking about a non-Christian there. He also says here that he has no ability to do right. Well, chapter 3 said it was humanity apart from Christ who could do no good. Chapter 8 will go on to show that the believer can and should do good. And then finally, if Paul was talking about his pre-conversion life in the previous section, you would think there would be some acknowledgement of a change in him before we dive into this section where he's talking about himself as a believer. But there's no recognizable conversion that's indicated. There's no shift that happens. It's not clear, oh, here I'm talking about myself before I came to know Christ, but then here's something has changed, something's different. So those are some of the arguments that claim that Paul is talking about a non-Christian here. Not to mention that this may have been your own experience before you came to Christ. Or maybe it's your current experience if you don't know him. This constant struggle to try to earn salvation through keeping the law. On the other hand, though, he could be describing the lifelong struggle that every Christian has with sin. That's been the majority view for a while now among biblical scholars, so why might we think that? Well, for one, when Paul was talking about his pre-conversion experience, he used the past tense. In verse 14, he shifts and he starts using the present tense. I am instead of I was. I do instead of I did. So it could very well be that he's describing his present experience now as a believer. Second, he says that he delights in the law and wants to do good. He wants to keep the law. Well, unbelievers don't delight in the law of the Lord, at least not the way the Bible commands us to. They don't have a longing to obey God, but this person does. So maybe this is a Christian. Third, correspondingly, Paul says here that he hates sin. Non-Christians don't hate their sin. They love their sin. John 3:19, and this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. The person that hates their sin only hates their sin because their eyes have been opened to it. They've had a spiritual transformation. They've been reborn. And then lastly, Paul distinguishes here between himself or his inner being and his flesh. Only in a Christian can there be that distinction and conflict between those two things. So that gives weight to the view that Paul is describing a believer. Not to mention that I'm sure in our experience, yours and mine, every single Christian has experienced that firsthand, the desire to do good and the seeming inability to do what you want to do. So we got two options out here. Both of them are based on what Paul says, what he writes. So what do? It's difficult. For every point, there's a counterpoint. It's like Vizzini in the movie The Princess Bride. So I can clearly not choose the wine in front of me, and I can clearly not choose the wine in front of you. If you missed that reference, go watch the movie The Princess Bride. We're stuck. or at least it seems that way. Kind of like the man Paul describes in verse 24, wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this confusing passage, right? Now, to be honest, I find myself leaning toward this as a description of an unbeliever, that first description that I gave you, person who's trying to save themselves through keeping the law. In our sermon prep, Caleb finds himself kind of leaning the other way, that this is describing the ongoing battle for believers. But maybe, and I hope this doesn't sound like another cop-out, maybe Paul's point in context isn't for us to argue about the spiritual status of this individual, trying to assign him to either the category of lost or saved. Not that that doesn't matter, but maybe his bigger point here is to show us the powerlessness of the law in this battle against sin, whether you're a Christian or not. That if you find yourself wanting to do the right thing, the law is the wrong tool for the job. It's not like a drain plunger that you can kind of tweak and make it work. It is like that regular drill trying to put holes in concrete. Try all you want. It's not getting the job done. The law, the Ten Commandments, this list of rules cannot break the power of sin in your life. For the non-Christian, maybe somebody like Paul who had been exposed to the law, somebody who understands their own guilt and their own sin, understands their own spiritual death and the demands of the law, but then turns to their own morality and their own attempts, their own ability to try to keep the law to fix that. All of those efforts will result in nothing but defeat and death. He will, in the end, know only frustration and wretchedness and this unmet need for deliverance. On the other side, for the Christian who, in an attempt to please God, in an attempt to grow in sanctification, turns to his own efforts to keep the rules rather than trusting in the Holy Spirit to produce obedience and godliness in him, he will also know nothing but frustration and spiritual stagnancy. The law doesn't empower him to defeat the sin in his life. So both of those things are true, right? Both of those are spiritual realities. That the law cannot bring you from death to life, and the law, pursuing the law, trying to keep the rules, doesn't make you more holy, doesn't sanctify you, doesn't make you more Christ-like. Both of those things are true. And both come with a word of warning. If you believe and you teach that this passage describes a non-Christian, that what Paul's describing here is an unbeliever trying to work his way to salvation, please don't take that to mean that Christians, or that you as a Christian, don't or won't struggle against sin. You absolutely will. You'd be setting yourself up for failure to tell yourself that that's not a reality for believers. David, in the Bible, the man after God's own heart, struggled, battled against sin, and even gave into it. Peter struggled against sin. Paul struggled against sin. You can and you will find yourself in a war. Right? And if you believe and teach that this passage describes a believer, that this is a Christian that he's describing, don't take that to mean that the Christian life has to be one of inevitable frustration and defeat. If you think that this describes the life of a believer, this doesn't mean that you are helpless against sin. You are not fundamentally a sinner saved by grace, but you are a saint who continues to struggle with sin, but who is more than a conqueror. Paul says in Galatians 5, verses 16 through 18, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law." So there is a struggle, to be sure, but there is victory. Not total victory in this life, but meaningful and growing victory as we walk by the Spirit, not by keeping a list of rules. Because here's the truth. If you turn to the law, if you turn to keeping a list of rules in your battle against sin, to defeat that power of sin, you will experience defeat. If you don't know Jesus, that defeat will be a final and lasting defeat that results in spiritual death and the suffering of God's wrath against your sin. If you do know Jesus, it will be a frustrating, paralyzing defeat that will hinder your spiritual growth and your witness. The law is the wrong tool for the job of the fight against sin. Thankfully, there is someone who can accomplish exactly what we need. The law can't do it, but who can? Jesus. Jesus has delivered us from defeat through his sinless life of perfect obedience that was lived to earn righteousness for us, through his sacrificial death on the cross in our place to pay our penalty for our sin so that we might be forgiven, and through his glorious resurrection from the dead to defeat our final enemy and to secure for us the life that we were intended to live from the beginning. The law leads to defeat. Jesus has rescued us from defeat if we will put our trust in him. And not only that, but Jesus will deliver us from defeat fully, finally, ultimately, when he returns and he crushes all his enemies. The law won't do that. The law can't do that. Only Jesus can. Only Jesus will. And so we rest in him, not the law. Not this list of rules that stands outside us making demands on us. We abide in him, not our own abilities. We trust in him, not our rule keeping. The law is the wrong tool for the job, but Jesus is exactly what we need from first to last. Amen? If you'll pray with me.